Welcome back to Night Visitors. I'm your host, and tonight we're heading into the forests of Oregon. Now, before we dive in, I need to ask you something. Have you ever been alone in the woods at night? I mean truly alone. No cell service, no lights, nobody for miles. That feeling you get when you realize you're not at the top of the food chain anymore. The 5 people in tonight's stories know that feeling very well. And they discovered something much worse than being prey. Here's what I can tell you. These stories come from official reports that were buried, recordings that went missing, testimonies that were marked unexplained and locked away. These aren't campfire tales or internet legends. These happened to real people doing real jobs in the Oregon wilderness. And here's what I can't tell you yet. What they saw, what they heard, what touched them in the dark. Because if I told you now, you wouldn't believe me. You need to hear it from them. All I'll say is this. After what happened, some of these people never went back into the forest. Some couldn't even talk about it without breaking down. And one of them, well, they never came back at all. If you're new to Night Visitors, subscribe now and hit that bell. We tell the stories that keep people awake at night. All right, turn off your lights, because we're going deep into the Oregon wilderness. And what's waiting there? It's been watching for a very long time. Let's begin. My name is Jake Morrison, and I've been a park maintenance worker at Mount Hood National Forest for 12 years. I clean campsites, fix broken picnic tables, and maintain the restrooms across 47 different camping areas. I've seen bear attacks, found lost hikers, and cleaned up after storms that could flatten entire sections of forest. I thought I'd seen everything this job could throw at me. But what happened in July 2024 changed everything I thought I knew about the forest I call home. Some things in the wilderness aren't meant to be understood. I started working at Mount Hood right after high school. My dad was a ranger here for 30 years before he retired, so I grew up knowing these trails better than most people know their own neighborhoods. The Forest Service hired me because I could handle the isolation and the physical work. Most people can't spend 8 hours alone in the wilderness, fixing things and dealing with whatever nature throws at you. But I loved it. The quiet, the fresh air, the feeling that I was taking care of something bigger than myself. My daily routine was simple but important. I'd start at sunrise, driving my Forest Service truck along the winding camp roads. I'd check each campsite for damage, empty the trash cans, clean the restrooms, and make sure everything was safe for the next group of campers. During peak season, I might visit 30 sites in a single day. I carried a radio to call in problems, a first aid kit, and basic tools for quick repairs. The work was honest and straightforward. People came to enjoy nature, and I made sure they had a clean, safe place to do it. Mount Hood gets thousands of visitors every summer. Families drive up from Portland, couples escape the city for romantic weekends, and kids experience camping for the first time. Most campers are respectful and follow the rules. They pack out their trash, put out their fires completely, and leave the sites cleaner than they found them. But sometimes I'd find messes that took hours to clean up, or dangerous situations where people had left fires still burning. That's why I always did thorough checks of every site. The forest itself is massive and wild. Thick stands of Douglas fir and cedar stretch for miles in every direction. The trails wind through areas where you can walk for days without seeing another person. It's beautiful, but it's also dangerous if you don't respect it. People get lost, injured, or worse when they underestimate how quickly the wilderness can turn deadly. My job was to keep the front country safe, but I always knew that beyond the maintained campsites, the real wilderness began. July 15th started like any other Tuesday morning. The weather was perfect for camping, warm and clear with just enough breeze to keep the bugs away. I was working Section 7, which included campsites 40 through 50. These sites were popular because they were close to the main trail but still felt secluded. I'd already checked 6 sites that morning, finding the usual minor issues. A broken picnic table at Site 42. Some trash that had blown out of the bin at Site 45. Normal stuff that took a few minutes to fix. When I pulled up to campsite 47, something felt wrong immediately. The site looked occupied, but there was no car in the parking area. 3 tents were set up in a perfect triangle around the fire pit. A large family tent and 2 smaller ones, all expensive gear that looked brand new. The fire was still burning, with a pot of beans bubbling over the flames. Steam was rising from coffee cups on the picnic table, but there were no people anywhere. I turned off my truck and listened. In a normal occupied campsite, you'd hear voices, movement, maybe kids playing or adults talking. But this site was completely silent except for the crackling of the fire and the bubbling of the pot. I called out hello several times, thinking maybe the family had gone to the restroom or taken a short walk. No one answered. That's when I noticed the shoes. Outside, each tent entrance was a neat row of footwear. Hiking boots, sneakers, and small children's shoes, all lined up perfectly parallel to each other. It looked like a family had carefully removed their shoes before entering their tents, but then never came back out. The shoes were still slightly damp with morning dew, which meant they'd been sitting there for hours. I walked closer to the picnic table and saw car keys, wallets, and 3 cell phones sitting next to the coffee cups. These weren't the kind of things people would leave behind if they went for even a short hike. I picked up one of the phones and saw it was unlocked, showing multiple missed calls and text messages. Someone named Sarah had been trying to reach them since the night before. The food told the clearest story. The pot of beans was still hot, meaning the fire had been tended recently. But the beans were starting to burn on the bottom. 2 plates had half-eaten breakfast on them, with forks still sitting in the eggs. 1 coffee cup was still steaming. Everything suggested that a family had been sitting here eating breakfast just minutes ago, then suddenly stood up and walked away, leaving everything behind. I used my radio to call it in to dispatch. Unit 7 to base, I've got an abandoned campsite at 47. Looks like a family left in the middle of breakfast. All their belongings are here, including car keys and phones. Dispatch told me to secure the area and wait for a supervisor. They thought maybe the family had gone for an early morning hike and would be back soon. But as I looked around more carefully, I realized that couldn't be right. All the hiking boots were still lined up by the tents. If they'd gone hiking, they would have worn their boots, not walked barefoot into the forest. And who leaves their car keys and phones behind when going on a hike? None of it made sense. I decided to look for footprints to see which direction they might have gone. The campsite had soft dirt around the edges that would show clear prints. What I found made my skin crawl. Leading from each tent toward the tree line were small barefoot tracks. A man, a woman, and 2 children had walked away from their camp with no shoes on. The prints were clear and deep, showing they'd walked calmly, not running. But here's what really bothered me. The footprints just stopped, not gradually, like they'd reached harder ground or rocks. They ended abruptly at the edge of the trees, as if the 4 people had simply vanished into thin air. I followed the tree line for 50 yards in both directions, looking for where the tracks continued. There was nothing. It was like they'd been lifted off the ground. My supervisor, Dave, arrived 20 minutes later with a park ranger. They took photos of everything and called in a search and rescue team. By afternoon, we had 20 people combing the area around campsite 47. The K9 units tracked the scent to the exact spot where the footprints ended. Then the dogs lost the trail completely. It was like the family had just evaporated. Search and rescue spent 3 days looking for them. They brought in helicopters, thermal imaging equipment, and more dogs. They searched a 5-mile radius around the campsite. They found absolutely nothing. No clothing, no signs of struggle, no indication of what had happened to 4 people who had simply vanished while eating breakfast. On the 3rd day, I was helping with the search when I found something that made everything worse. About 100 yards into the forest, in a small clearing I'd never noticed before, was a neat pile of clothes. 4 complete sets, stacked in perfect order. Men's clothes on the bottom, women's clothes next, then children's clothing on top. They were folded with mechanical precision, like someone had taken great care to organize them. I called over the search coordinator, and we examined the clothes carefully. They were the same sizes and styles that would fit the missing family. But more disturbing, the clothes were still warm, like they'd just been taken off. They smelled like body heat and soap, as if someone had folded them minutes ago. But there were no other signs of human presence. No footprints, no disturbed ground, nothing to indicate how the clothes had gotten there. The K9 units tried to track from the clothing pile, but again, they lost the scent immediately. It was like the trail just ended. The search and rescue team was baffled. In 20 years of wilderness rescue, the coordinator told me, he'd never seen anything like it. People don't just disappear without leaving some kind of trace. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the warm clothes and the perfect footprints that led nowhere. Something had taken that family, but what? And why had they gone willingly? There were no signs of struggle, no indication they'd been forced to leave. They'd simply stood up from breakfast and walked barefoot into the forest. 2 days later, I was doing my regular rounds when I found campsite 32 in the exact same condition. A couple from Portland had vanished, leaving behind a warm breakfast, their shoes lined up by the tent, and all their personal belongings on the picnic table. The same barefoot prints leading to the tree line, the same abrupt end to the trail, and when I searched deeper into the forest, I found another neat pile of warm, folded clothes. This time, I didn't wait for my supervisor. I set up a trail camera that night, aimed at the general area where people seemed to be disappearing. If something was taking campers, I wanted to see what it was. I hid the camera in a tree about 50 yards from where the footprints always ended and set it to record continuously. For a week, nothing happened. Then I found another abandoned campsite. Same pattern, same mysterious circumstances. When I checked the trail camera, the footage showed something that made my hands shake as I watched it. The video started normally, a family sleeping peacefully in their tents around midnight. Then, at exactly 3 a.m, all 4 tent flaps opened simultaneously. The family members sat up in perfect unison, their eyes open but staring ahead like sleepwalkers. They moved with strange, mechanical precision, getting dressed and emerging from their tents at exactly the same time. But here's what really scared me. They weren't moving like themselves anymore. Their movements were too coordinated, too synchronized. They removed their shoes and placed them in neat rows without looking down, like they'd done it 1,000 times before. Then they walked toward the tree line in single file, their faces blank and expressionless. The audio was mostly static, but underneath the electronic interference, I could hear something else. A low, rhythmic sound that might have been singing or chanting. It was beautiful in a way that made me want to listen closer, even though it came through the camera speakers as distorted noise. As the family reached the tree line, they began removing their clothes with the same mechanical precision. They folded each item carefully and placed it in a neat pile, working together like they'd rehearsed it. Then, completely naked, they walked into the darkness between the trees. The camera continued recording for several hours, but the family never came back. In the morning, their campsite looked exactly like all the others I'd found. Breakfast half prepared, belongings scattered on the table, shoes lined up by the tents, like they'd vanished in the middle of their normal routine. But the most disturbing part of the footage came near the end. As the naked family disappeared into the forest, the camera caught movement deeper in the trees. Dozens of other naked figures were walking through the darkness, all moving in the same direction. Some looked like adults, others appeared to be children. They moved silently through the trees like a strange procession, all heading toward something deeper in the forest. I watched the footage a dozen times, trying to understand what I was seeing. The figures looked human, but they moved wrong. Too coordinated, too purposeful, and they were all heading somewhere specific, following what looked like a well-worn trail through the trees. I knew I should report this to my supervisor, but who would believe me? I had video evidence, but it was so bizarre that people would think I'd faked it somehow. Instead, I decided to investigate on my own. I needed to know where those people were going. The next day, I followed the path the naked figures had taken in the video. It led deeper into the forest than I'd ever gone, through sections that weren't on any park map. The trail was subtle but clear once you knew what to look for. Broken branches, worn spots in the ground, and strange markings on trees that looked almost like symbols. As I walked deeper into the forest, I started finding personal belongings scattered along the trail. Wedding rings, watches, glasses, and dental fillings. Things that would be left behind if bodies decomposed naturally. But there were so many items, spread out over what looked like miles of trail. It suggested this had been happening for much longer than just the past few weeks. The items seemed to be organized by age. The deeper I went, the older the belongings became. Near the beginning of the trail, I found recent smartphones and modern jewelry. Further in, there were older cell phones, then watches and jewelry from earlier decades. The pattern suggested people had been disappearing in this forest for years, maybe decades. After 2 hours of hiking, I reached a clearing that made me stop dead in my tracks. It was perfectly circular, about 100 feet across, with no trees or vegetation growing in it. The ground was packed dirt, worn smooth like it had been walked on countless times, and at the center of the clearing was a hole in the ground that defied explanation. The hole was perfectly round, about 10 feet across, and impossibly deep. I couldn't see the bottom, even when I shined my flashlight down into it. The walls were smooth, like they'd been carved by something, not worn by water or weather. And from the depths came a sound that made my entire body respond against my will. It was singing. Beautiful, wordless singing that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The melody was complex and haunting, unlike anything I'd ever heard. And as I listened, I felt an overwhelming urge to get closer to the hole, to hear the music more clearly. I found myself taking steps toward the edge, without deciding to move. My body wanted to follow that sound, to find its source. The singing seemed to be calling specifically to me, promising something wonderful if I would just come closer. I had to force myself to back away, and even then, part of me wanted to stay and listen. The ground around the hole was covered with personal belongings. Thousands of items, organized in careful circles, radiating out from the edge. Jewelry, clothing, shoes, and personal effects from what must have been hundreds of people. The items closest to the hole were old and weathered, some dating back decades. It was like a massive collection of everything people had been wearing when they disappeared. As I examined the belongings more closely, I started recognizing some of them. A watch I'd seen on a missing person poster from 5 years ago. A distinctive ring that belonged to a hiker who'd vanished the previous summer. These weren't random items. They belonged to specific people who had disappeared in the forest, people whose cases had never been solved. The singing grew stronger as afternoon turned to evening. The melody became more complex, more beautiful, and harder to resist. I found myself sitting at the edge of the clearing, just listening. My rational mind knew I should leave, should get back to my truck, and report what I'd found. But the music made it hard to think clearly. As darkness fell, the singing became irresistible. I stood up and walked toward the hole, not caring about anything except getting closer to that beautiful sound. I wanted to see where it was coming from, to understand what was making such perfect music. Nothing else seemed important. I was 3 steps from the edge when my radio crackled to life. Unit 7. Please respond. Unit 7. What's your location? It was dispatch, doing their evening check-in. The static and electronic interference broke through the spell, and I suddenly realized where I was and what I was about to do. I grabbed my radio and responded, backing away from the hole as quickly as I could. Unit 7 here, returning to base. I didn't wait for a response. I turned and ran back through the forest, following my own footprints in the growing darkness. Behind me, the singing continued, but it sounded angry now, frustrated that I'd escaped. I made it back to my truck and drove straight home, but the music followed me. Even with the radio turned up loud, I could hear that melody playing in the back of my mind. It was like an earworm that wouldn't go away, except this one made me want to drop everything and go back to the forest. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard the singing and saw that perfectly round hole in the ground. I kept thinking about all those personal belongings, all those people who had walked naked into the forest and never come back. They'd been drawn by the same music I'd heard, the same irresistible call. The next morning, I went to my supervisor and tried to explain what I'd found. I showed him the trail camera footage and told him about the clearing and the hole. He listened patiently, then suggested I take some time off. The stress of finding so many abandoned campsites was getting to me, he said. Maybe I was seeing patterns that weren't really there, but I knew what I'd experienced was real. The disappearances continued, following the same pattern. Families would vanish from their campsites, leaving behind warm food and neat piles of clothing. The search and rescue teams never found any trace of them, and I was the only one who seemed to understand what was happening. I tried different approaches to block out the singing. I wore noise-canceling headphones during my shifts, played loud music in my truck, and even considered taking medication to help me sleep. But the call wasn't just auditory. It got into your mind in ways that couldn't be blocked by physical barriers. It made you want to join the others, to become part of whatever was happening in that clearing. The worst part was that I was starting to understand why people went willingly. The singing promised something beyond ordinary life. It offered a kind of peace and purpose that regular existence couldn't match. When I heard it, my job seemed meaningless. My daily routines felt empty. Only the music mattered. I started avoiding certain areas of the forest where the call seemed stronger. I changed my patrol routes to stay away from the sites where people disappeared most often. But it didn't matter. The influence was spreading, becoming stronger each night. I could feel it pulling at me, even when I was at home, miles away from the forest. 3 weeks after I found the clearing, I made a decision that probably saved my life. I requested a transfer to a different forest, as far from Mount Hood as possible. I told my supervisor I needed a change of scenery, that 12 years in the same place had burned me out. He approved the transfer, probably glad to get rid of someone he thought was having psychological problems. My last day at Mount Hood was the hardest day of my career. As I cleaned out my truck and turned in my equipment, I could hear the singing calling to me from the deep forest. It knew I was leaving, and it was making one final attempt to draw me back. Part of me wanted to go. Part of me still wants to go. I'm working at a different forest now, 300 miles south. The work is the same, but the woods are different, safer. I haven't found any abandoned campsites or mysterious disappearances. The camping areas stay filled with happy families who pack up their gear and drive home at the end of their vacations. But I still hear the singing sometimes, especially at night when it's quiet. It's fainter now, but it's still there, calling to me across the distance. I know that someday I'll go back to Mount Hood. The call is patient and persistent, and it knows I'll return eventually. I've tried to warn other park workers about what I found, but no one believes me. They think the isolation and stress of the job made me paranoid. Maybe they're right. Maybe I imagined the whole thing, but I don't think so. If you're planning to camp at Mount Hood National Forest, be careful. If you hear beautiful singing in the night, don't listen. Don't try to find where it's coming from. Pack up your gear and leave immediately. The forest is collecting people, and they go willingly into the darkness. The disappearances are still happening. I check the missing persons reports online, and every few weeks, another family vanishes from the Mount Hood area. The official investigations never find anything. They assume people got lost in the wilderness or had accidents. But I know the truth. Somewhere deep in the forest, there's a hole in the ground that calls to people with the most beautiful music imaginable. And everyone who hears that call eventually answers it. They walk naked into the darkness, leaving behind everything they once thought mattered. I managed to resist it once, but the song is still playing in my head. Every night, it gets a little louder, a little more persuasive. I'm starting to understand that escape isn't really possible. The forest has marked me, and it's just a matter of time before I return. When that day comes, I'll drive back to Mount Hood and park at campsite 47. I'll remove my shoes, place them in a neat row, and walk barefoot into the trees. I'll follow the trail of personal belongings to the circular clearing, and I'll finally learn what lies at the bottom of that impossibly deep hole. The singing promises that I'll understand everything then. That I'll become part of something larger and more meaningful than my small human life. That I'll join the others who answered the call before me, walking naked through the forest toward whatever waits in the depths. Until then, I'm trying to live a normal life. I go to work, pay my bills, and pretend that I don't hear music calling to me from the wilderness. But late at night, when the world is quiet, I can hear them all singing together. Hundreds of voices, maybe thousands, creating the most beautiful harmony imaginable. And I know that someday soon, my voice will join theirs. My name is Maria Santos, and I've been a trail crew supervisor for the Oregon Parks Department for 15 years. I started as a seasonal worker right out of college, clearing brush and fixing broken wooden bridges on hiking trails. Over the years, I worked my way up to supervising a team of 6 people who maintain over 200 miles of trails across 3 different forest areas. I've seen a lot in my time out there. Bears, mountain lions, injured hikers who got lost for days. I've pulled people out of ravines, treated snake bites, and found missing kids who wandered off the main path. I thought I'd seen everything the Oregon wilderness could throw at me. My crew always joked that nothing could scare Maria Santos after all the crazy stuff I'd handled. But what happened in August 2024 on the Whisper Creek Trail changed everything I thought I knew about my job. What we found up there wasn't just another routine repair project. It was something that made me question whether some trails should stay closed forever. I'm telling this story because 3 more hikers went missing last week on that same trail. The Park Service is calling it another bear attack, just like they always do. But I know what's really out there, and I can't stay quiet anymore. Asterisk, asterisk, Section 2. Professional context and setup, asterisk, asterisk. The Whisper Creek Trail runs for 8 miles through some of the thickest forest in the Oregon Coast Range. It's an old logging road that got turned into a hiking trail back in the 1982, winding through Douglas fir and cedar trees so tall they block out most of the sunlight during the day. The trail climbs about 2,000 feet up the mountainside, crossing 3 different creek beds before ending at a small waterfall. We hadn't done any work on Whisper Creek since 2019. That's when the Park Service closed it, after too many hikers complained about having bad experiences up there. People reported feeling watched, hearing strange sounds, finding weird animal tracks. Some hikers came back early, saying they felt unsafe for reasons they couldn't explain. Management decided it was easier to just close the trail than deal with all the complaints. But after the big storm we had in March 2024, fallen trees were blocking trails all over our district. We got orders to clear everything and get all trails ready for the busy summer season. Whisper Creek was on the list, even though it had been closed for 5 years. My team wasn't thrilled about working on a trail that far from the main road. When something goes wrong in the deep woods, it takes hours for help to reach you. Cell phone service cuts out about 2 miles up the trail, and the thick tree cover makes it impossible for helicopters to land anywhere nearby. But we needed the overtime pay, and it was supposed to be just a 3-day job clearing fallen logs. I brought my most experienced crew members, Dennis, who'd been doing trail work for 12 years, Sarah, our best chainsaw operator, Mike and Tony, 2 brothers who could move logs faster than anyone, and Lisa, our newest hire, but someone who knew the forest better than most veterans. We loaded up our work truck with chainsaws, hand tools, a first aid kit, emergency radio, and enough food and water for 3 days. The plan was simple: drive to the trailhead, hike in with our gear, clear the fallen trees, and mark any spots that needed major repairs for a future crew to handle. Looking back, I should have listened to my gut feeling when we parked at the trailhead that first morning. The parking area was completely overgrown with blackberry vines and small trees. It looked like no one had been there in years, not just since 2019. Even the trail sign was covered in moss and hard to read. The whole place felt forgotten, like nature was trying to take it back. But I had a job to do, and my crew was counting on me to keep things moving. We shouldered our packs and started hiking up the trail at 7 in the case morning, expecting to reach the first work site by noon. Asterisk, asterisk, Section 3. First anomaly, asterisk, asterisk. The first thing we noticed was how quiet the forest was. I've worked in the woods for 15 years, and there's always some kind of sound: birds singing, squirrels chattering, insects buzzing. But Whisper Creek Trail was dead silent. Not even the wind moved through the trees. Dennis mentioned it first. "This is weird, Maria. Where are all the animals?" He was right. We didn't see a single bird, squirrel, or even a bug for the first 2 hours of hiking. The only sounds were our own footsteps and the occasional creak of tree branches high above us. About 3 miles up the trail, we started finding pieces of fabric caught on tree branches. At first, I thought it was just litter from old hikers who hadn't been careful with their gear. But when I looked closer, the fabric pieces looked like they'd been torn off violently. Some were just small scraps, but others were big chunks of what looked like jacket material or pants fabric. "Look at this," Sarah called, from about 20 feet ahead of us. She was pointing at a piece of blue fabric hanging from a broken branch about 8 feet off the ground. "How does cloth get torn off up there? You'd have to be really tall or climbing the tree." The fabric was definitely torn, not cut. The edges were jagged, like something with claws had ripped it away from someone. And it wasn't faded from weather. It looked fresh, maybe a few months old at most. We kept hiking and finding more pieces. Red fabric, green fabric, what looked like pieces of a hiking boot sole. Mike started collecting them in a plastic bag, thinking we should document everything for the Park Service. Then Sarah made the discovery that changed everything. She was using her handsaw to cut some smaller branches blocking the trail when she called out, "Maria, you need to see this right now." I walked over to where she was working and looked down. There, in the dirt, Mixed in with old leaves and pine needles were several small white objects. At first glance, they looked like rocks or maybe pieces of a broken bottle. But when I knelt down for a closer look, my stomach dropped. They were teeth. Human teeth. Adult teeth with the roots still attached, like they'd been knocked out by force. "Jesus," Dennis whispered behind me. "Are those what I think they are?" I used a stick to move some of the leaves around and found more bones. Small finger bones, pieces of what looked like a skull, all bleached white by weather but definitely human. And every single bone had marks on it, deep scratches and gouges that looked like bite marks from something with massive teeth. Lisa, who'd been quiet most of the morning, suddenly spoke up. "We should call this in. This is a crime scene." I pulled out my radio, but we were too far from any relay towers to get a signal. My cell phone showed no service, just like I'd expected. We were on our own until we hiked back to the parking area. "We need to document everything," I told my crew. "Take pictures, mark the location, but don't touch anything else. We'll report it as soon as we get back." But even as I said it, I knew something was wrong about this whole situation. The bones were scattered over a wide area, not buried or hidden. It was like something had been feeding here and just left the remains scattered around for anyone to find. That's when we heard it for the first time. A low, deep breathing sound coming from somewhere in the trees around us. It was too loud and too slow to be human breathing. It sounded like something huge was watching us work. **SECTON4. Escalation and supernatural manifestation. **. The breathing sound lasted for about 30 seconds, then stopped completely. We all froze and listened, but the forest went back to that unnatural silence. "Did everyone else hear that?" Tony asked, looking around nervously. We all nodded. There was no mistaking it. Something big was out there in the trees, and it was close enough that we could hear it breathing. I made the decision to keep working but stay close together. We had a job to finish, and I wasn't going to let some unknown animal scare us off. Bears and mountain lions lived in these woods, and they usually avoided humans anyway. But as we continued up the trail, the signs got worse. We found claw marks scratched deep into tree bark, starting about 4 feet off the ground and going up as high as 15 feet. No bear I'd ever seen could reach that high, and the marks were huge. Each claw scratch was as wide as my finger. Mike found tracks in a muddy spot near a creek crossing. They looked like bear paw prints, but they were twice the size of any bear track I'd seen in 15 years of trail work. The prints were so deep they'd been pressed into the mud like whatever made them weighed close to 1,000 pounds. "Maria," Sarah said quietly, "I think we should head back. This doesn't feel right." I was starting to agree with her, but we'd already hiked 4 miles and were getting close to the main work area. We could finish the job in 1 more day if we pushed through. That's when Dennis decided he needed to step off the trail to relieve himself. He walked about 50 feet into the trees, behind a big Douglas fir where we couldn't see him. 30 seconds later, he started screaming. Not yelling or calling for help, screaming like he was in pain or terrified out of his mind. We all dropped our tools and ran toward the sound, crashing through bushes and fallen branches. We found Dennis standing frozen about 10 feet from a partially buried human body. It was just a torso, with the arms and legs torn off and missing. The wounds looked fresh, maybe a few days old, and something had been feeding on it. Chunks of flesh were missing, and the exposed bones had those same bite marks we'd seen earlier. Dennis couldn't speak. He just stood there, shaking and pointing at the body. His face had gone completely white, and when I touched his arm, he felt like ice. "We're leaving right now," I announced. "Everyone pack up, we're hiking out." But when I pulled out my radio to call for emergency evacuation, all I got was static. My cell phone was completely dead, even though it had been working that morning. Sarah checked her phone and got the same result. No signal, no power, nothing. We were 8 miles from the nearest road, with no way to call for help, and something was definitely watching us from the trees. I could feel eyes on us constantly, and every few minutes we'd hear branches breaking as something large moved parallel to the trail. I tried to keep everyone calm as we packed our gear, but I was starting to panic myself. In 15 years of trail work, I'd never seen anything like this. The human remains, the huge tracks, the strange breathing sounds. Nothing about this situation was normal. As we started hiking back toward the parking area, the breathing sounds started again. this time they were coming from multiple directions, like more than one creature was surrounding us. And they were getting closer. Asterisk, asterisk, Section 5. Climax and Professional Crisis. Asterisk, asterisk. We'd only been hiking for about an hour when we realized whatever was out there wasn't just watching us anymore. It was actively following us. Every time we stopped to rest, we could hear heavy footsteps circling our position. Branches would snap and bushes would shake as something huge moved through the forest just out of sight. The smell hit us next. A horrible stench like rotting meat and wet fur that got stronger every time the wind changed direction. It was so bad that Lisa had to cover her nose with her shirt to keep from gagging. "It's hunting us," Mike whispered. "Whatever killed those people is tracking us right now." I wanted to tell him he was wrong, but I could feel it too. The presence of something predatory and intelligent that was staying just close enough to let us know it was there. This wasn't random animal behavior, it was deliberate intimidation. We were about 2 miles from the trailhead when Sarah found the shelter. It was built in a small clearing about 30 feet off the main trail, hidden behind a wall of thick bushes. At first, it looked like maybe a homeless camp or an old hunting blind. But when we got closer, we could see what it was really made of. Human bones. Dozens of them, wired and tied together to form a crude shelter about 6 feet tall and 8 feet wide. Arm bones, leg bones, ribs, all bleached white by weather but clearly arranged by something with intelligence. And covering the bone framework were pieces of torn clothing, jackets, pants, hiking boots, backpacks, like trophies hung up for display. Inside the shelter were more body parts. Arms, legs, a few complete heads, all in various stages of decay. Some looked fresh, maybe a week old. Others were just bones and dried skin. They were arranged in neat piles, like food storage, in some kind of twisted pantry. Sarah took one look inside and vomited so hard she couldn't stand up. The smell was beyond horrible. Death and decay, and something else, something animal and wild. "We have to get out of here right now," I told everyone. "This thing isn't just killing people, it's collecting them." I helped Sarah to her feet while Dennis and the others formed a protective circle around us. Everyone was trying to stay calm, but I could see the panic in their eyes. We were in the territory of something that hunted humans for food, and we were still miles from safety. That's when the trees started shaking. Not swaying in the wind, violently shaking like something enormous was grabbing them and rattling them on purpose. The sound was incredible, like a freight train crashing through the forest. And it was coming from all around us. Through gaps in the trees, we caught our first real glimpse of what was hunting us. Brown fur, massive claws, standing upright like a person but at least 12 feet tall. Its arms were longer than any human's, reaching almost to the ground when it stood straight. And when it turned its head toward us, I could see its face clearly for just a moment. It looked like a bear, but wrong. The eyes were too intelligent, too focused. The teeth were too long and sharp, and when it saw us looking back, it opened its mouth and made a sound I'll never forget. Part roar, part human scream, like it was trying to communicate but could only make animal noises. Then it started moving toward us, crashing through the underbrush faster than anything that size should be able to move. "Run!" I screamed. We ran down that trail faster than I've ever moved in my life. Behind us, the creature was keeping pace easily, breaking trees and roaring every few seconds. It was playing with us, letting us know it could catch us any time it wanted. Dennis was carrying Sarah, who still couldn't walk steady after what she'd seen in the bone shelter. Mike and Tony were trying to clear branches out of our way, while Lisa and I brought up the rear with our emergency radio and first aid kit. Every 100 yards or so, the creature would get close enough that we could smell its breath, hot and rotten, like meat that had been left in the sun for weeks. But it never quite caught us. It was hurting us, driving us toward the parking area for reasons I didn't want to think about. Asterisk, asterisk, Section 6. Resolution and aftermath, asterisk, asterisk. We reached the trailhead parking area, just as the sun was starting to set. Our truck was still there, covered in pine needles and looking like it hadn't been disturbed. But as we were loading our gear and helping Sarah into the passenger seat, the creature finally emerged from the tree line. It stood at the edge of the forest, about 50 feet away, watching us with those horrible, intelligent eyes. In the fading daylight, I could see it clearly for the first time. It was massive, at least 12 feet tall and probably weighing close to 1,000 pounds. Its fur was dark brown and matted, covering muscles that looked powerful enough to tear a person in half. But the worst part was its face. It had the basic shape of a bear, but the expressions were almost human. It was studying us, memorizing our faces, like it was planning to find us again later. I started the truck and backed out of the parking space as fast as I could. The creature didn't move to stop us, but it watched us drive away. In my rearview mirror, I could see it standing there until we rounded the first curve and lost sight of it. We drove straight to the sheriff's office and reported everything. The human remains, the bone shelter, the creature that had hunted us. The deputies took our statements and promised to send a team up there the next day to investigate. But when they came back, their story didn't match what we'd seen. They claimed they found evidence of a bear attack and some scattered bones that were probably from hikers who died in accidents over the years. The bone shelter? They said it was just fallen logs and debris that looked like a structure from a distance. Within a month, the Park Service had the trail reopened. They put up new signs warning about bear activity, but they insisted it was safe for experienced hikers who followed proper precautions. I tried to protest, but my supervisor made it clear that my job depended on supporting the official story. The Park Service couldn't afford to have people think there was some kind of monster living in the forest. Tourism money was too important. 3 weeks after the trail reopened, a family of 4 went hiking on Whisper Creek and never came back. Search teams found their backpacks and some bloody clothing scattered over several miles, but no bodies. The official report blamed a rogue bear that had supposedly been relocated to another area. But I knew better. That thing was still up there, still hunting, still collecting trophies from the people it killed. 6 months later, I started finding evidence that it had learned where I lived. Huge claw marks scratched into my front door, the smell of rotten meat lingering around my house at night. Sometimes I'd wake up to the sound of breathing outside my bedroom window, that same deep, slow breathing we'd heard on the trail. I moved to Idaho last year, thinking distance would keep me safe. But yesterday, I woke up to fresh claw marks on my back door, and that familiar smell in my yard. I think it tracked me across state lines. I think it remembers my face from that day in the forest, and it's not done with me yet. The Park Service is still calling the disappearances bear attacks. They're still sending families up that trail, telling them it's perfectly safe as long as they make noise and carry bear spray. But I know what's really up there, and I know that someday it's going to finish what it started. If you're ever in Oregon and you see signs for the Whisper Creek Trail, don't go. Tell your friends not to go. That trail should have stayed closed forever. Some things in the forest are better left alone. My name is Tom Martinez, and I've been working security for the National Park Service for 12 years. I started as a seasonal ranger at Yellowstone right after college, then moved to year-round security work when I got married and needed steady pay. I've handled everything from drunk tourists to wild animal encounters to search and rescue operations in the middle of winter storms. I thought I'd seen every kind of trouble that could happen in a national park. But what happened during my night shifts at Crater Lake National Park in October 2024 made me realize there are some things that no amount of training can prepare you for. I've been the night security guard at Crater Lake for 3 years now. My job is pretty simple. I drive around the park after closing time, making sure all the buildings are locked up tight and watching for people who might try to camp illegally or cause trouble. The park closes to visitors at sunset, but we get a lot of people who think the rules don't apply to them. Crater Lake sits in the caldera of an ancient volcano in southern Oregon. The lake itself is almost 2,000 feet deep, one of the deepest lakes in the world. During the day, it's beautiful. The water is this incredible blue color that doesn't look real. Tourists come from all over the world just to stand at the rim and take pictures. But at night, when everyone's supposed to be gone, the place feels different. Colder. Quieter than it should be. My patrol route covers about 33 miles of rim drive and all the visitor facilities. I start at the main visitor center, check the gift shop and restrooms, then drive clockwise around the rim. There are several overlook points where people can park and walk to the edge for better views. The most popular one is called Discovery Point, 1810. It's where the first white settlers saw the lake back in 1853. During peak season, that parking lot can hold maybe 50 cars, and it's usually packed all day. I drive a white Ford F-150 with park security painted on the sides. It's got a spotlight mounted next to the driver's mirror and a radio that connects me to the main ranger station 20 miles away. The truck also has an emergency medical kit, flares, and a lockbox with zip ties in case I need to detain someone until the county sheriff can get there. My shift starts at 10 p.m. and runs until 6 a.m. Most nights are pretty boring. I might find a couple of teenagers drinking beer at one of the overlooks or catch someone trying to set up a tent in an area where camping isn't allowed. The biggest excitement is usually helping someone with a flat tire or dead battery. But in early October 2024, I started noticing something weird. Cars were still parked at the overlooks after the park closed. At first, I figured people were just running late getting back to their vehicles. Sunset in October is around 6:30, and the park officially closes at 7 p.m. Sometimes visitors lose track of time taking photos or hiking the short trails. The strange part was that the cars would be there when I started my rounds at 10 p.m., but they'd be gone by morning. Not just moved, completely gone, like they'd never been there at all. And these weren't just 1 or 2 cars. Some nights I'd count 8 or 10 vehicles in various parking areas after hours. I started keeping a log of the license plates and vehicle descriptions. Toyota Camry from California, Honda Pilot with Oregon plates, a red Jeep Cherokee with camping gear strapped to the roof. I figured if people were sneaking back to get their cars before dawn, maybe I could catch them and issue some citations. Illegal camping in a national park can result in fines up to $500. But after a couple weeks of this pattern, I started finding things that didn't make sense. Personal belongings scattered around the parking lots. A woman's purse sitting on the ground next to where a blue sedan had been parked the night before. Car keys lying on the asphalt. Wallets with cash and credit cards still inside, just abandoned. One morning, I found a cell phone near the Discovery Point overlook. It was an iPhone in a pink case with a cracked screen. When I picked it up, it started buzzing with missed calls and text messages. The caller ID showed Mom calling over and over. The text messages said things like, "Sarah, where are you?" and "Please call me back. I'm worried sick, and the police are asking questions about your car." I turned the phone in to my supervisor, Janet Morrison. She's been the chief ranger at Crater Lake for 15 years and has seen just about everything. But when I explained about the abandoned cars and personal belongings, she just shrugged and said it was probably teenagers playing pranks or people losing their stuff while they were drunk. "Tom," she said, "people do stupid things when they're partying in the woods. They drop their keys, forget their purses, maybe even abandon their cars if they're too drunk to drive. Don't read too much into it." But I couldn't stop thinking about those text messages from the girl's mom. The fear in those messages was real. And what kind of prank involves leaving behind your wallet with $300 cash inside? I started paying closer attention during my rounds. Instead of just driving through the parking areas and shining my spotlight around, I began parking my truck and walking the overlooks with my flashlight. I wanted to understand what was happening to these people. The Discovery Point overlook has a stone wall about 4 feet high that runs along the rim. It's got gaps every few feet where people can step through to get closer to the edge for photos. During the day, there are always families lined up along that wall, kids pointing at the water, parents taking pictures. At night, it should be empty. On October 15th, I was doing my second round of the evening when I saw movement at Discovery Point. My headlights caught 3 figures standing near the stone wall. A family, it looked like, 2 adults, and what might have been a teenager. They were just standing there, perfectly still, facing the lake. I parked my truck and grabbed my flashlight. As I walked toward them, I called out, "Excuse me, folks, the park is closed for the evening. I need you to head back to your vehicle." They didn't respond, didn't even turn around. I got closer and could see them more clearly in my flashlight beam. A man in a blue jacket, a woman in jeans and a white sweater, and a teenage boy wearing a baseball cap. They were standing about 3 feet apart from each other, hands at their sides, staring out at the dark water. "Sir? Ma'am?" I said louder. "The park is closed. You need to leave now." That's when I noticed how they were standing. Too straight, too still, like mannequins posed at the overlook. Normal people fidget, shift their weight, turn their heads when someone's talking to them. These 3 were frozen in place. I walked around to the side to see their faces. Their eyes were wide open but completely blank, no expression at all. The man's mouth was slightly open, and I could see his breath in the cold air, so I knew they were alive. But it was like nobody was home behind those eyes. I reached for my radio to call for backup, but before I could key the mic, all three of them started walking. Not toward me or their car, but toward the stone wall. They moved in perfect sync, like robots programmed to follow the same commands. "Hey!" I shouted. "Stop! Don't go near the edge!" But they kept walking. They stepped through a gap in the stone wall and right up to the rim. I ran after them, but they were already standing at the very edge, their toes hanging over empty space, 2,000 feet of air between them and the water below. I was maybe 10 feet away when they jumped. All three of them, at exactly the same time. They didn't run or leap, they just stepped forward into nothing and disappeared into the darkness. I heard no splashes, no screams, just silence. I rushed to the edge and shined my flashlight down into the caldera, but the beam didn't reach far enough to show the water. Just black rock walls disappearing into deeper blackness. I grabbed my radio and called for emergency services. "This is Tom at Crater Lake. I need search and rescue at Discovery Point immediately. 3 people just jumped from the rim." Janet's voice came back crackling with static. "Tom, slow down. What exactly did you see?" "A family of 3. They walked right off the edge. I watched it happen." "Are you certain? It's pretty dark out there." "I'm certain. I was talking to them not 2 minutes before they jumped." "Okay, I'm calling County Search and Rescue. Don't leave that area." I spent the next 4 hours standing at Discovery Point, waiting for the rescue team. They brought boats and diving equipment, underwater cameras, even a helicopter with searchlights. But they found nothing. No bodies, no floating debris, nothing. The dive team leader, a guy named Rick who'd been doing water rescues for 20 years, pulled me aside after they called off the search. "Tom, I've been all over this lake," he said. "Water's clear down to about 300 feet. If 3 people hit this water tonight, there would be some trace of them. Bodies don't just disappear." "I know what I saw," I told him. "I believe you saw something," Rick said. "But maybe it wasn't what you thought it was." When the sun came up, I walked back to the parking area to look for the family's car. I'd seen a white SUV parked there when I first arrived, but it was gone. Not just moved to a different spot, gone completely. The parking lot was empty except for my truck. Janet drove out to meet with me before my shift ended. She looked tired and stressed. "Tom, the county spent $12,000 on that search and rescue operation," she said. "They found no evidence that anyone went into that water last night." "The family's car is gone too," I said. "It was parked right here. Maybe they left before you. Thought they jumped. Maybe what you saw was shadows or wildlife." "Janet, I was close enough to see their faces. They were people." She was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the lake. "Tom, you've been working nights for 3 years. That can mess with your head. Lack of sleep, isolation, stress. I think you should take a few days off and maybe talk to someone." "You think I'm crazy?" "I think you're a good employee who's been under a lot of pressure. Take the rest of the week off. We'll have Bill cover your shifts." I went home, but I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about those blank faces and the way they moved in perfect sync. I'd seen people commit suicide before, what it was part of the job. But this was different. Those people weren't suicidal. They weren't even conscious. 3 days later, I came back to work. Janet had me meet with Dr. Sarah Chen, a psychologist who worked with Park Service employees dealing with trauma. Dr. Chen was nice enough, but she clearly thought I'd had some kind of breakdown. She asked about my sleep schedule, my stress levels, whether I'd been drinking or taking any medications. She recommended I consider switching to day shifts to help with my circadian rhythm. Working nights can create sleep deprivation that leads to hallucinations, she explained. Your brain tries to fill in gaps in perception, especially in low-light conditions. What you thought you saw might have been your mind creating a narrative to explain shadows and movement that you couldn't quite identify. I nodded and agreed to consider her recommendations, but I knew what I'd seen was real, and I was determined to prove it. Over the next 2 weeks, I paid even closer attention during my rounds. I brought a digital camera and made sure my flashlight batteries were fresh. If something like this happened again, I wanted evidence. On October 30th, Halloween night, I saw them again. This time it was a couple in their 60s, standing at the Watchman overlook on the north side of the rim. Same pose, perfectly still, staring at the water. I parked my truck and approached them slowly, camera ready. "Excuse me," I called out softly. No response. I got close enough to see their faces clearly. The man had gray hair and was wearing a red windbreaker. The woman had on a blue jacket and white tennis shoes. Both of them had that same blank expression I'd seen before. I raised my camera and took several photos with the flash. The bright light lit up their faces, but they didn't blink or react at all. I was standing maybe 6 feet away, and they acted like I wasn't even there. Then they started walking toward the edge. This time, I was ready. I ran ahead of them and positioned myself between them and the rim. "Stop," I shouted. "Don't come any closer." They walked right into me, not around me, into me, like they couldn't see me at all. The man's shoulder hit my chest and knocked me backward. I grabbed his arm, but his skin felt wrong. Too cold, too stiff. I tried to hold on to them, but they were stronger than they should have been. The woman pushed past me with force that sent me stumbling. Both of them stepped through the stone wall and walked right off the edge. Again, no sound when they fell, no splash, no impact. Just silence. I looked at the photos on my camera, but they showed nothing. Just empty darkness where the couple should have been. The flash had illuminated the stone wall and some trees, but there were no people in any of the pictures. I called for search and rescue again, but this time Janet told me to stand down. "Tom, we're not sending a team out based on another unconfirmed sighting," she said over the radio. "Come back to the office. We need to talk." The next morning, Janet informed me that I was being placed on administrative leave, pending a psychological evaluation. She recommended I take at least a month off and get some professional help. "I want to help you, Tom," she said, "but I can't have a security guard who's reporting incidents that aren't really happening. It's a liability for the Park Service." "What about the missing cars? The abandoned personal belongings? We get lost property reports all the time. People drop things, forget things, lose things. It doesn't mean they disappeared into thin air." I cleaned out my desk and turned in my radio and park keys. But I wasn't ready to give up. I'd seen something real, and I needed to understand what it was. I started researching the history of Crater Lake, looking for any reports of unusual incidents or disappearances. What I found made my blood run cold. The lake formed about 7,700 years ago when Mount Mazama collapsed and created the caldera. The Klamath tribe, who lived in the area for thousands of years, considered the lake sacred but dangerous. According to their legends, the lake was the battleground between two powerful spirits, Skell and Lau. Lau lived beneath the water and would pull people down to join him in the depths. The tribal stories described people becoming empty shells when they looked into the water for too long. They would walk into the lake and never come back out. The tribe avoided the rim at night and warned their children never to stare at the water after dark. I found newspaper articles from the early 1900s about tourists who went missing at Crater Lake, a family from Portland in 1923, 2 honeymooners in 1931, a group of college students in 1954. In every case, their cars were found in the parking areas, but the people vanished without a trace. The official reports always blamed accidental drowning, but no bodies were ever recovered. And in several cases, witnesses reported seeing the missing people walking toward the rim just before they disappeared. I also found internal Park Service memos from the 1972nd discussing unusual incidents at the rim overlooks. Rangers had reported finding abandoned vehicles and personal belongings, just like I had. There were recommendations to install security cameras and increase night patrols, but those measures were never implemented due to budget constraints. One memo mentioned a security guard named Frank DeLuca who worked at Crater Lake from 1978 to 1981. He'd filed multiple reports about people jumping from the rim, but the incidents were never confirmed. DeLuca eventually quit and moved to California. The memo noted that he'd suffered a stress-related breakdown and was receiving psychiatric treatment. I found Frank's contact information online and called him. He was 73 years old and living in San Diego, but he remembered his time at Crater Lake clearly. "I knew this day would come," he said when I told him about my experiences. "I knew eventually someone else would see what I saw." Frank described incidents identical to mine. People standing motionless at the rim, walking off the edge without making a sound, vanishing without leaving any trace. He'd tried to document it, tried to warn his supervisors, but no one believed him. "The lake doesn't want to be exposed," Frank told me. "It's been collecting people for thousands of years, maybe longer. The Native Americans knew to stay away, but we white folks always think we know better." "But why? What's in that water?" "I don't know if it's something in the water or something about the place itself," Frank said. "All I know is that lake calls to people, shows them things, makes them want to come closer, and once it has them, it sends them back as, I don't know what to call them. Copies, maybe. Empty shells that walk around for a while before they collapse." "You saw the same thing? People coming back after they jumped?" "Oh yeah, that's the worst part. You watch someone fall to their death, then an hour later you see them walking back to their car like nothing happened. But they're not really there anymore. Something else is wearing their body." Frank advised me to stay away from Crater Lake, especially at night. "That place marked you," he said. "It knows you can see what's really happening. It'll try to claim you too." But I couldn't stay away. Despite being on leave, I drove back to the park on November 5th. I wanted to see the overlooks during daylight, to look for any clues about what was happening there. During the day, everything looked normal. Families taking photos, kids throwing rocks, tourists reading the informational plaques. The water was that impossible blue color that made the lake famous. Beautiful and peaceful. But as the sun started to set and the tourists headed back to their cars, I felt a change in the atmosphere. The air became thicker, harder to breathe. The temperature dropped more than it should have for just losing sunlight. I walked to the edge of Discovery Point and looked down at the water. At first, it just looked black in the fading light, but the longer I stared, the more I could see. There were faces in the water. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds. Men, women, children, all floating just below the surface. Their eyes were open, and they were looking up at me. Some of the faces looked recent, but others seemed older. Much older. And they were all moving their mouths like they were trying to say something. I felt a strong urge to lean closer, to try to hear what they were saying. The stone wall seemed lower than before, easier to step over. The water looked inviting, despite the cold. I took a step toward the edge, then caught myself. This was how it happened. This was how the lake claimed people. It showed them the faces of everyone who'd come before, made them want to join the collection. I backed away from the rim and ran to my car. But as I was driving away, I saw my own reflection in the rearview mirror. Except the reflection wasn't looking at the road. It was turned toward the passenger seat, staring at me with those same blank eyes I'd seen on the others. I stopped the car and looked in the mirror again. My reflection was normal, looking back at me from the driver's seat. But for a moment, I'd seen something else. Something that wanted me to come back to the water. I quit my job the next day and moved to Arizona. I couldn't stay in Oregon knowing what was happening at that lake. But I still monitor missing persons reports from the Crater Lake area. Every few months, there's another case. A family that doesn't return from their vacation. A couple whose car is found empty in the parking lot. Solo hikers who vanish without a trace. The official reports always say the same thing: death apps, accidental drowning in Crater Lake. But I know the truth. Something ancient lives in that water, something that's been collecting souls for thousands of years. It calls to people, shows them visions, makes them walk to their death, and then it sends them back as empty shells to fool anyone who might be watching. The worst part is that it's still happening. Right now, as I'm telling you this story, families are driving up to Crater Lake to see the beautiful blue water. They'll take their photos and read the signs about the geological history. And if they stay too long after dark, if they stare into that water when the sun goes down, they might see the faces looking back at them. If you ever visit Crater Lake, enjoy the view during the day. But when the sun starts to set, get in your car and drive away. Don't look back at the water. Don't listen to any voices that might call your name. Because once that lake knows you can see it for what it really is, it'll never stop trying to add you to its collection. My name is Amy Chen, and I've been a fire prevention specialist for 12 years. My job is tracking weather patterns from remote mountain stations to predict wildfire danger. I've worked through lightning storms, flash floods, and even a bear breaking into my equipment shed. I thought I'd seen everything the wilderness could throw at me. But what happened in August 2024 at the old Cascade Ridge monitoring station showed me there are things in the forest that no amount of training can prepare you for. I specialize in solo operations at high-altitude weather stations. These places are usually 8 to 10 miles from the nearest road, accessible only by helicopter or a brutal hike with a full pack. Most people can't handle the isolation, but I love it. No office politics, no meetings, just me and the mountains doing work that actually saves lives. The equipment I use isn't fancy, but it's reliable. Wind speed monitors, humidity sensors, temperature gauges, and a satellite communication system that links everything back to the Forest Service headquarters in Portland. The data gets transmitted every hour, and if something looks dangerous, I can trigger early warning systems that reach thousands of people. My supervisor called me on a Tuesday morning in August. "Amy, we need you at Cascade Ridge Station," he said. "The place has been empty for 3 years since the last guy quit." "What happened to him?" I asked. "Burnout, I guess," said the isolation was getting to him. "Made some strange reports about feeling watched. You know how it is up there alone." I did know. Solo assignments could mess with your head if you weren't careful. Some people started seeing things that weren't there or hearing voices in the wind. But I'd never had problems like that. The helicopter dropped me off on Wednesday morning. Cascade Ridge Station sat on a small clearing about 50 feet from the tree line. It was a simple one-room building with thick walls, designed to withstand mountain weather. Solar panels on the roof powered the equipment, and there was a small generator for backup. Inside, everything looked normal. The previous guy had left the place clean, canned food in the cupboards, fresh batteries for the flashlights, even a deck of cards on the table. The only weird thing was scratches around the windows, like something had been clawing at them from outside. I spent the first day checking all my equipment. The wind monitor was working fine, humidity sensors were giving good readings, and the satellite link connected to headquarters without any problems. Everything seemed perfect. That night, I cooked dinner and settled in to read. Around sunset, I glanced out the window and saw something that made me stop eating. There was a figure standing at the edge of the forest. It was tall and thin, but something about it looked wrong. Too tall, maybe 8 feet, with arms that hung down past where its knees should be. Its head was tilted to one side like it was listening to something I couldn't hear. I grabbed my binoculars and looked closer. The thing was pale, almost white, and completely naked. Its face was hollow, like someone had scooped out everything behind the skin. But the worst part was how still it was. Not moving, not breathing, just standing there, watching my building. I put down the binoculars and counted to 10, thinking my eyes were playing tricks. When I looked again, the figure was still there. And now there was another one 20 feet to its left. As the sun got lower, more figures appeared. They came out of the forest one by one and took positions around my station. I counted 23 of them, forming a perfect circle, all facing my building, all standing perfectly still. I tried to take pictures with my camera, but every photo just showed empty forest. The display screen would show the creatures clearly when I aimed, but the actual pictures came out blank. My hands were shaking, so bad I could barely hold the camera steady. When full darkness fell, they started moving closer. They didn't walk like normal people. They glided across the ground without moving their legs, floating a few inches above the forest floor. No sound, no rustling leaves, just silent movement toward my station. By midnight, they were close enough that I could see their faces through my windows. Their eyes were completely black, like deep holes in their heads. Their mouths hung open, showing rows of sharp teeth that were too long and too thin, like needles. That's when the tapping started. They pressed their faces against the glass and began tapping with their long fingers. Not random tapping, but a pattern. Tap, 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 pause, tap, tap, pause, tap, 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 tap. Over and over, all around the building. The sound came through the walls and seemed to get inside my head. I tried calling for help on my satellite phone, but I couldn't get a signal. The display showed full bars, but every call failed. My radio was completely dead, not even static. The creatures had somehow cut off all my communications. The tapping continued all night. Every time I tried to sleep, the sound would get louder or change rhythm, like they knew I was relaxing. I sat in the center of the room with a flashlight, watching their pale faces pressed against every window. When sunrise came, they retreated back into the forest. but I could see them standing just inside the tree line, still watching. I went outside to check for damage and found strange symbols scratched into the dirt around my building. They were geometric patterns, lots of triangles and spirals that seemed to twist and move when I wasn't looking directly at them. Staring at them too long made my head hurt and my vision blur. The second day was worse. The creatures came out during daylight hours, standing at the forest edge and swaying back and forth in perfect unison. They were studying me, learning my routines. When I checked equipment on the north side, they all turned to watch. When I moved to the south side, their heads followed, like they were tracking my every move. My supply truck was supposed to come that afternoon with fresh food and water. It never showed up. I later found out the driver had turned around 5 miles from the station, claiming he felt like something was following his truck through the forest. That night, the tapping was louder and more aggressive. The creatures pressed harder against the windows, leaving oily smears that smelled like rotting meat. I could hear them moving on the roof, their fingers scraping against the metal. By the third day, they were leaving gifts for me. I found a dead deer arranged in one of those twisted geometric patterns about 50 feet from my door. Its blood had been completely drained, and its bones were bent into impossible shapes. More dead animals appeared throughout the day. Rabbits, squirrels, even a large bird, all bloodless and twisted. The trail of dead animals led into the forest. Against my better judgment, I followed it. About half a mile from the station, I found their nesting area in a grove of dead trees. What I saw there almost made me lose my mind. Hundreds of bodies hung from the branches like sick decorations. They had once been human, but they were stretched and distorted until they looked like the tall creatures. Their faces were hollow, their arms elongated, their skin pale and waxy. Some looked fresh, others were just dried husks swaying in the wind. I understood then what the creatures wanted. They were collecting people, transforming them somehow. The missing fire specialist from 3 years ago was probably hanging in those trees somewhere. I ran back to the station and barricaded every door and window I could find. But that night, the creatures got inside anyway. I don't know how they did it. All my barriers were still in place. But I woke up to find one standing at the foot of my bed. Up close, I could see it had once been human. Its face still had traces of features I recognized, like looking at someone through a funhouse mirror. It reached toward me with those impossibly long fingers. When it touched my arm, the skin went completely numb, like all the life was draining out of it. I jerked away, and it glided backward through the wall like it was made of smoke. My equipment started acting crazy. The weather monitors showed impossible readings, temperatures of 500 degrees and wind speeds of 800 miles per hour. The display screens filled with those twisted geometric symbols instead of normal data. Even my watch stopped working properly. Every night, more creatures appeared inside the building. They would touch me briefly and then fade away, each contact leaving my skin colder and more numb. I could feel myself changing, becoming weaker and stranger. I tried to escape on foot, but they herded me back like sheepdogs. They appeared on every trail, blocking my path and forcing me to return to the station. They wanted me to stay, to complete whatever process they had started. The worst part was how patient they were. They could have taken me by force, but they wanted me to give up willingly. To stop fighting and let them finish transforming me into one of them. I'm recording this on my laptop while I still can. My hands are getting longer and thinner each day. My skin is turning pale, and my face is starting to feel hollow. The numbness is spreading up my arms and legs. The helicopter is supposed to come get me in 3 days when my assignment ends, but I don't think I'll be human enough to leave by then. The creatures know this too. They've stopped the aggressive tapping and just wait outside, watching patiently while I become more like them. I can feel my thoughts getting stranger, more focused on joining them in the forest. Part of me wants to walk outside and let them finish what they started. The human part of me is fighting to stay alive, but it's getting harder every hour. If someone finds this recording, don't come looking for me. Don't send anyone else to Cascade Ridge Station. Board up the place and stay away. There are things in these mountains that shouldn't exist, and they're hungry for more people to add to their collection. The tapping has started again, but now it sounds almost like music. Beautiful, hypnotic music that makes me want to open the door and dance with them under the stars. The geometric patterns on my computer screen are starting to make sense, like they're telling me something important. I think I understand now what they're offering. Not death, but transformation into something beyond human limits. A chance to join their eternal forest family and help them find others who are lost and alone like I was. The door is calling to me. My new family is waiting outside. Maybe being human was overrated anyway. Amy Chen's laptop was found 3 weeks later by a Forest Service recovery team. The Cascade Ridge station was empty, except for the computer and a trail of geometric symbols scratched into the wooden floor. Amy herself was never found, though hikers sometimes report seeing unusually tall figures watching them from the tree line in that area. The station was permanently closed and the building demolished 6 months later. Official reports blamed structural damage from severe weather, but the work crew that tore it down refused to stay overnight and demanded hazard pay for the job. Local tribal elders were not surprised by the incident. They had been warning the Forest Service for decades about that particular mountain, which they called the place where spirits collect the lost. According to their traditions, certain peaks were gathering places for entities that fed on isolation and despair. Dr. Marcus Webb, Amy's supervisor, retired early after reviewing her final reports. "She was the most level-headed person I knew," he said in his exit interview. "If Amy Chen said there were monsters in those mountains, then there were monsters. I'm not sending anyone else up there to find out." The Forest Service has since moved to automated weather monitoring systems for remote locations, eliminating the need for solo human operators. They claim this change was made for cost efficiency, but internal memos suggest concerns about personnel retention in isolated postings. Amy's equipment was recovered and showed no signs of malfunction. The impossible readings she described were not stored in any of the data logs, and the geometric symbols never appeared on any screens during laboratory testing. Whatever interfered with her instruments left no trace that conventional science could detect. The dead animals she mentioned were never found, and wildlife cameras in the area show no unusual activity. The grove of dead trees she described does exist, but aerial surveys revealed only normal forest decay with no signs of the horrific display she witnessed. The trail of missing people in that region, however, is very real. Over the past 50 years, 17 hikers, researchers, and forestry workers have vanished in a 20-mile radius around Cascade Ridge. Most disappearances were attributed to natural causes like avalanches, animal attacks, or simple navigation errors. But Amy's recording suggests something far more deliberate and intelligent behind these incidents. Something that understands human psychology well enough to use isolation and fear as tools for harvesting victims. The Forest Service has quietly updated their protocols to require teams of at least 3 people for any work in that mountain range, though they publicly cite safety concerns rather than supernatural threats. Rangers are instructed to report any sightings of unusually tall figures or geometric ground markings immediately. Amy Chen's fate remains unknown, but her warning stands as a testament to the dangers that may lurk in America's most remote wilderness areas. Her final words serve as a chilling reminder that some places on Earth are not meant for human habitation, and some hungers are older and more patient than we can imagine. For those who work alone in the wilderness, Amy's story offers a sobering lesson. Isolation can be a tool for predators that think and plan in ways we've never considered. And sometimes, the most dangerous thing in the forest isn't what you can see. It's what's been watching you all along, waiting for the perfect moment to add you to its collection. The mountain remains closed to public access, hidden behind bureaucratic red tape and environmental protection orders. But on clear nights, pilots flying over the region sometimes report seeing lights moving through the forest in organized patterns, like dancers performing an ancient ritual that no human was ever meant to witness. Amy Chen wanted to protect people from wildfire danger. In the end, she may have saved countless lives by documenting a threat far more dangerous than any natural disaster, one that the Forest Service hopes will remain buried in classified files and forgotten memories. My name is Steve Morrison, and I've been a forest inventory specialist for the Oregon Department of Forestry for 12 years. I catalog tree species, measure their health, and map forest conditions across the state's wilderness areas. I've hiked through every type of terrain Oregon has to offer, from coastal rainforests to high desert pine stands. I've dealt with aggressive wildlife, sudden weather changes, and equipment failures in places where cell phones don't work and the nearest road is 20 miles away. I thought I knew every danger the forest could throw at me. But what happened in October 2024, in a remote section of the Cascade Range, showed me that some places in the wilderness aren't meant for human visitors. I should have known something was wrong when I got the assignment. The area I was being sent to survey hadn't been checked since 1995. Nearly 30 years without any official Forest Service presence is unusual, especially for a region that's supposed to be part of our regular rotation. When I asked my supervisor, Jim, why it had been skipped for so long, he just shrugged and said the previous crews had reported difficult terrain and access issues. But looking at the topographic maps, it seemed straightforward enough. Rolling hills covered in Douglas fir and western hemlock, with a few clear cuts from the 1,980 seconds that should have grown back by now. The area was designated as Sector 47B on our survey maps, about 15 miles northeast of Mackenzie Bridge. Getting there required a 4-hour drive on logging roads that got progressively narrower and more overgrown. The final 2 miles were barely passable, forcing me to park my truck and hike in with my gear. I carried my standard inventory kit, GPS unit, diameter tape, increment borer for taking tree core samples, digital camera, and my field notebook. Everything was fully charged and tested before I left the office. The weather that morning was perfect for forest work. October, in the Colin-Ross Cascades can be unpredictable, but this day was clear and cool, with just enough breeze to keep the mosquitoes away. The forecast called for sunny skies all week, so I planned to spend 3 days in the area, camping overnight to complete the full survey. I'd done hundreds of these solo assignments over the years, and this one felt routine. The hike into Sector 47B took about an hour through dense second-growth forest. The trees were mainly 40 to 50 years old, which matched what I expected to see based on the logging history. But as I got deeper into the survey area, I started noticing things that didn't make sense. The forest was too quiet. In 12 years of field work, I've learned to read the signs of a healthy ecosystem. You should hear birds, insects, small animals moving through the underbrush. This forest was silent, except for the wind in the branches. The first tree I measured was a Douglas fir, about 60 feet tall and 18 inches in diameter. Standard stuff, except when I tried to take a core sample with my increment borer, the bit kept hitting something hard about 3 inches into the trunk. I've bored thousands of trees, and you learn to feel the difference between healthy wood, rot, and metal objects like old fence staples. This felt different, like hitting bone. I moved to another tree and got the same result. The third tree I tried actually broke my boring bit when I hit whatever was inside. I'd brought spare bits, but breaking one was unusual. These tools are designed to handle knots and other obstacles in the wood. I made a note in my field book and decided to focus on measuring diameters and heights rather than taking core samples. That's when I looked up and saw the first body. It was hanging 30 feet up in a Douglas fir, impaled through the chest by a massive wooden spike that had grown right out of the trunk. The person was wearing hiking gear from the 1,990 seconds, faded green jacket, old-style hiking boots, and a day pack that had been bleached by decades of weather. The dry mountain air had preserved the body like a mummy. It hung there like some kind of terrible scarecrow, arms and legs dangling. I stood there staring for maybe 5 minutes, trying to process what I was seeing. Then I started looking around more carefully. That's when I realized the forest was full of them. Bodies hanging in trees at different heights, all impaled by wooden spikes that had clearly grown out of the tree trunks. Some were recent enough that you could still make out their clothes. Others were just bones held together by dried tendons and scraps of fabric. Every single spike looked deliberate. They weren't random branches. They were perfectly shaped points that had been carefully positioned to pierce through a human chest or abdomen. The spikes were smooth and polished, like someone had spent time carving them. But they were growing out of living wood, integrated into the tree's trunk as if they'd always been there. I counted 27 bodies in the immediate area. Men and women of different ages, all wearing outdoor gear from different time periods. Some had hiking poles still strapped to their packs. Others carried old-fashioned camping equipment. A few had cameras hanging around their necks. They were all visitors to the forest, just like me. My hands were shaking as I pulled out my digital camera to document what I was seeing. The Oregon State Police would need evidence, and the families of these missing people deserved answers. But when I pressed the power button, nothing happened. The battery indicator had shown full charge when I left my truck 2 hours earlier. Now it was completely dead. I tried my GPS next. The screen flickered and showed impossible readings. According to the device, I was 300 feet underground, despite standing on a hillside in broad daylight. Then the screen went black. My backup GPS unit did the same thing. Even my digital watch stopped working. Every piece of electronic equipment I carried was failing simultaneously. In 12 years of field work, I'd never experienced anything like this. Equipment failures happen, but not everything at once, and not when all the devices had been working perfectly an hour earlier. I decided to get out of there immediately and report what I'd found. But when I tried to retrace my steps back to the truck, the forest looked different. Trails that hadn't been there before appeared between the trees. Paths I remembered walking on were gone. The spacing between trees seemed to have changed, creating new openings and blocking old ones. I've been lost in the woods before. It happens to everyone who spends time in the wilderness. But this wasn't normal disorientation. The forest was actively changing around me. When I marked a tree with my knife and walked in a straight line away from it, then turned around, the marked tree was gone. In its place was a different tree with no marks on it. That's when I noticed the branches moving. At first I thought it was just the wind, but the movement was too deliberate, too coordinated. Branches would reach down toward me as I walked past, like hands trying to grab my clothes and equipment. When I looked directly at them, they'd freeze. When I looked away, they'd keep moving. It was like being stalked by the entire forest. I tried to push through a dense section of undergrowth, but the branches kept tangling around my ankles and catching on my pack. Every time I freed myself from one snare, 2 more would form. The trees were working together, communicating through creaking and rustling sounds that seemed almost like language. The forest floor started changing too. Solid ground would suddenly give way under my feet, revealing hidden pits lined with sharpened stakes. I stepped into 3 of these traps, only avoiding injury because I was wearing heavy boots and watching my footing carefully. Each pit was perfectly circular and about 4 feet deep, like giant punji stakes. The wooden spikes at the bottom were carved to razor points. After an hour of this, I realized I was walking in circles. No matter which direction I chose, the forest guided me back to the same grove where I'd first seen the bodies. The trees wanted me to see something specific. When I climbed on top of a fallen log to get a better view, I understood why. The impaled bodies weren't arranged randomly. From above, they spelled out words and letters made from human corpses. Feed US was written across the canopy in bodies hanging at just the right heights and positions. The forest had been collecting people for decades, arranging them into a message that could only be read from the air. The forest was hungry. It had been luring hikers, campers, and survey workers like me into this area to feed itself. The wooden spikes weren't just weapons, they were feeding tubes. The trees were draining nutrients from the bodies, using human blood and tissue to fuel their growth. I tried climbing one of the smaller trees to get above the canopy and see a way out. But as soon as I got 15 feet up, the trunk started bending and twisting, trying to shake me loose onto the spike traps below. Other trees began firing their needle-like leaves at me like projectiles. The needles were sharp enough to pierce my jacket and draw blood from my arms and face. The moment my blood hit the forest floor, everything changed. The trees became more excited, more aggressive. Branches wrapped around my arms and legs, trying to drag me toward the nearest spike. I could hear them communicating faster now, their creaking and rustling sounds building to a frenzy. They could taste my blood, and they wanted more. The trees started secreting a thick, amber sap that burned my skin on contact. Wherever the sap touched, my skin would blister, and my muscles would go numb. I was being slowly poisoned, weakened, so the forest could capture me more easily. My vision started blurring, and I had trouble keeping my balance. The forest sensed my weakness and began closing in from all sides. Branches wrapped around my arms like rope, trying to pull me toward a particularly large spike protruding from a massive fir tree. I cut myself free with my surveying knife, but the damaged branches healed instantly, growing back stronger than before. The forest was regenerating faster than I could hurt it. That's when I found the other survey equipment scattered around the base of the trees. GPS units, cameras, field notebooks, and measuring tools from different years. Some of the equipment looked recent, within the last 5 years. Others were older models I recognized from early in my career. The forest had been hunting people in my profession, specifically, eliminating anyone who might expose its secret. I found a field notebook from 2018 belonging to someone named Maria Santos. Her final entry read, Day 3 inches, Sector 47B. Trees are moving. Equipment failing. Can't find way out. If someone finds this, don't come alone. Bring fire. The page was stained with what looked like blood. Fire. Maria had the right idea. I carried emergency flares for signaling rescue teams, but I'd never thought of using them as weapons. I pulled out a road flare and struck it, filling the grove with bright red light. The trees immediately pulled back, their branches recoiling from the flame like they'd been burned. I lit a second flare and held one in each hand, creating a circle of light around myself. The forest backed off, but I could feel its anger. The creaking and rustling sounds became aggressive, almost like snarling. The trees were furious that their prey was fighting back, but I only had 6 flares, and they burned for about 15 minutes each. That gave me 90 minutes to find my way out of the forest before I'd be defenseless again. I started moving toward where I thought the logging road should be, using the flares to keep the branches at bay. The trees tried everything to stop me. They dropped heavy branches from above, trying to knock the flares out of my hands. They created new pit traps right in front of me, forcing me to jump over holes that appeared in seconds. They grew new barriers of thorny undergrowth to block my path. But as long as I had fire, they couldn't get close enough to grab me. I was down to my last flare when I finally saw my truck through the trees. The forest made one final attempt to stop me, dropping a massive tree trunk across my path just 50 yards from the road. But I was close enough to the tree line that some of the branches were already dead and dry. I used my last flare to set them on fire, creating a wall of flame that the living forest couldn't cross. I made it to my truck just as the flare burned out. Behind me, the fire I'd started was already going out. The living trees had somehow contained it, preventing it from spreading beyond the area I'd needed to escape. The forest was intelligent enough to sacrifice a few dead branches to save itself. I drove straight to the Mackenzie Bridge Ranger Station and reported what I'd found. The rangers listened politely, but I could see the doubt in their eyes. When I led them back to Sector 47B the next day with a full search and rescue team, we found nothing. No bodies, no wooden spikes, no evidence of the nightmare I'd experienced. The trees looked normal. My equipment worked perfectly. The only proof I had was Maria Santos's field notebook, which I'd managed to grab during my escape. But when the authorities contacted her family, they said Maria had died in a car accident 6 months after her last entry. She'd never made it home from her final survey assignment. I turned in my resignation the following week. I couldn't go back into the field, knowing what was out there. I work in the office now, processing other people's survey data, but I keep track of every assignment that goes to Sector 47B. In the past year, 3 more inventory specialists have been sent to that area. None of them came back. The official reports say they quit without notice or transferred to other districts. But I know better. The forest is still hungry, still growing, and it's getting smarter about covering its tracks. Sometimes I drive up to the logging road that leads to Sector 47B, just to see if anything's changed. The forest looks normal from the outside, but I can see new growth along the tree line, branches reaching further toward the road each year. One day, that hungry forest is going to spread far enough to reach the main highway. And then it won't need to wait for surveyors and hikers to come to it. It will be able to feed on anyone who drives by. If you work for the Forest Service, or if you're planning to hike in the Mackenzie Bridge area, stay away from Sector 47B. Don't trust the official maps that show it as normal forest land. And if you see trees with wooden spikes growing out of them, run. Run fast and don't look back. Because once that forest gets your scent, it will never stop hunting you. I still have nightmares about those bodies hanging in the trees, spelling out their hungry message across the canopy. And sometimes, when the wind is just right, I swear I can hear the trees calling my name, inviting me back to finish what we started. The forest knows I escaped, and it's waiting for me to return. But I won't give it the satisfaction. Some places in the wilderness should be left alone. Sector 47B is one of them.